Do you remember when Saturday mornings felt just a little bit dangerous? When the glow of the TV wasn't just bright and colorful, but strange, haunting, sometimes even sad? You might not have realized it then, but so many of the shows that defined your childhood were hiding something dark beneath the surface. Today, we're diving deep into 20 kids shows from the 80s that had surprisingly dark storylines, the ones that made you laugh, dream, and sometimes shiver, even if you couldn't explain why. You remember it, don't you? That mix of excitement and unease when the theme music started, the sense that you were stepping into another world, one that didn't always play by the rules. These shows weren't afraid to show loss, loneliness, or danger, and somehow that made them unforgettable. Let's start where the darkness was wrapped in bright colors and puppets. Fraggle Rock. At first glance, it was cheerful, silly, full of songs that got stuck in your head. But if you really think back, if you listen beyond the laughter, there was something quietly melancholic about it. The Fraggles lived underground, forever avoiding the towering gorgs above and the mysterious humans beyond the wall. It was a story about isolation, about societies divided by fear and misunderstanding. The Doozers worked endlessly, building fragile towers no one cared about. And you, sitting there with your cereal, were learning something. That the world is made up of invisible walls, and sometimes those walls never come down. Back then, Jim Henson wasn't trying to coddle you. He was trying to prepare you. He believed kids could handle big ideas like peace and prejudice. Compare that to today, when most kids' shows avoid sadness like it's a contagion. Do you ever wonder if that's why Fraggle Rock stuck with you longer than most cartoons? The Secret of Nimh. If you saw it as a kid, you remember how it felt more than how it looked. The atmosphere was heavy, mist curling through the grass, moonlight slicing across the field, every frame drenched in dread. Mrs. Brisby wasn't a hero in armor. She was a terrified mother trying to save her sick child. The villains weren't monsters, they were scientists, humans experimenting on rats until their minds broke. For a kid's movie, it was pure gothic tragedy. It taught you something uncomfortable. That courage isn't loud, it's quiet, desperate, born out of fear and love. The idea that kindness could exist inside terror. Maybe that's why this movie hit harder than you expected. Think about today's animation, safe, polished, formulaic. Back then, The Secret of Nimh looked you straight in the eye and said, the world can be cruel, but you still have to try. You felt that, didn't you? Watership Down. Now technically, it was a British story from the late 70s, but if you caught it in the 80s on VHS or TV, you know why it belongs here. You remember that cover, the one that tricked you into thinking it was another cuddly rabbit cartoon. And then, the horror hit. Blood, death, and the sheer brutality of survival. It wasn't a metaphor you could easily escape. The film dared to say that nature doesn't care about innocence, and you learned that early, maybe earlier than you should have. It wasn't about scaring you, it was about showing the truth that life and death coexist. You probably didn't have the words for it back then, but your stomach twisted when Bigwig was trapped in the snare. That sound, his strangled breathing, still echoes somewhere in the back of your mind. It was the first time animation made you feel mortal, and yet, when you think back now, don't you feel grateful for that honesty? For the raw, unfiltered way it showed you that every moment of beauty carries the shadow of its ending. The Transformers, the movie. You were just a kid, maybe holding your Optimus Prime action figure when it happened. You didn't know they were going to kill him. Nobody did. One moment he was the indestructible leader, the voice of hope, and the next, he was gone. His eyes faded to gray, and you sat there in silence, your heart sinking in a way you couldn't name. That movie wasn't just about robots, it was about grief. Hasbro didn't set out to traumatize you, they just wanted to sell new toys, but they accidentally taught you about loss. You learned that sometimes the good guy doesn't come back, and that heroism doesn't guarantee survival. Now, compare that to today, when death in children's stories almost never lasts. Back then, it was permanent, heavy, real, and when Optimus died, maybe you learned your first lesson about saying goodbye. Do you remember how that felt? The mix of confusion and heartbreak you didn't have the language for? The Neverending Story. This one haunts an entire generation. From the very first frames, it was clear. This wasn't just fantasy, it was myth. You watched a lonely boy escape into a book, only to realize the story was about him. The world of Fantasia wasn't dying because of monsters. It was dying because people stopped believing. That's not a message most adults even process easily, but as a kid, it sank deep. And the moment Artax sank into the swamps of sadness, that wasn't a plot point, that was a wound. You could feel the mud, the weight, the helplessness. The movie didn't save you from it, didn't cut away. It made you watch. It told you that grief doesn't always have a reason, and that even heroes can lose what they love. Today's stories rarely trust kids with that kind of emotion, but back then, the 80s believed you could handle the ache of growing up. Maybe that's why, even now, when you hear the opening notes of the Neverending Story theme, you feel that lump in your throat. You were learning that imagination is fragile, and so were you. BraveStarr. Here's one that people often forget had a surprisingly heavy moral weight. A space western, full of action, sure, but its heart was always human. You might remember the powers, eyes of the hawk, strength of the bear, but do you remember the episode about The Price? The one where a kid overdoses on a drug called Spin and dies? A kid's cartoon that showed the corpse of a child on screen. It didn't shy away from the reality of addiction or the pain it causes. BraveStarr didn't wrap the lesson in a bow. It just looked you straight in the eye and said, choices have consequences. Now compare that to the polished, algorithm-driven shows today, the ones that talk about challenges instead of mistakes. Back then, even the toys with catchphrases came with a conscience, and somewhere, deep down, those stories probably made you a little stronger. Do you think that's why they lingered? Because they respected you enough not to lie? By now you can feel the pattern forming. The 80s weren't just neon and synthesizers, they were shadow and substance. The shows you grew up with didn't just entertain you, they shaped how you understood fear, loss, courage, and love. They trusted you to feel deeply, and we're just getting started, because there were so many more. Stories about haunted puppets, dystopian futures, and broken worlds that somehow still believed in hope. But tell me, what was the one show that first made you realize childhood wasn't always safe? The one that stayed with you long after the credits faded? Do you remember Ewoks, the animated series? At first, it felt like comfort food for your imagination. Soft edges, bright colors, those teddy bear warriors from Return of the Jedi now living out smaller, safer stories. But if you look closer, that forest wasn't just magical, it was haunted. The tone was gentle, yes, but the lessons were chilling. So many episodes centered on loss, greed, and dark spirits lurking just outside the circle of light. You might recall Logray the shaman warning against using forbidden magic. The forest always punished arrogance. That wasn't an accident, it was mythology disguised as Saturday morning fun. The show carried that eerie message: nature is alive and it remembers everything. Compared to today's shiny, ironic reboots, Ewoks had the strange stillness of an old folktale. You could almost feel the damp leaves, the ancient fear of what hides beyond the firelight. Do you ever think that's why it stuck in your head, the way it whispered instead of shouted? And then there was the Real Ghostbusters. You probably tuned in for laughs and proton packs, but the writing, especially in the early seasons, was steeped in genuine darkness. It wasn't afraid of cosmic horror. The ghosts weren't just comic villains, they were beings from nightmares, shaped by grief, jealousy, and the forgotten corners of the human psyche. You can probably still picture that episode where Egon gets trapped in a ghost dimension, his body frozen while his spirit drifts through a gray wasteland. The show didn't blink. It let you sit with the fear that even heroes could be lost forever. The sound design alone, the low hum of ectoplasm, the moan of unseen voices, was enough to raise goosebumps. That's what the 80s did so well. It trusted you to sit with the eerie. Today, kids' ghost shows wink at you, make a joke to break the tension. Back then, they let the fear breathe. Do you remember that strange thrill? The feeling that you were seeing something you maybe weren't supposed to? Let's talk about Dungeons & Dragons. Even now, that opening sequence gives you chills. The kids in the roller coaster suddenly transported to a realm where dragons, demons, and despair ruled the skies. They never got home. Week after week, they fought, they hoped, they searched for a way back, and the final episode was never even aired. Think about that. A children's show where the heroes never escape, where the villain, Venger, might not even be truly evil, just lost. There was no easy resolution, no bright promise that everything will be okay. It was a story about perseverance in the face of hopelessness, about growing up when there's no way out. You could almost feel the weight of that world, the cracked earth, the endless twilight, the fear that you'd be trapped forever. You didn't need blood or jump scares, just that quiet dread of not belonging. Can you feel it again? That tiny ache you didn't have a name for back then? And then came ThunderCats. A show about cat warriors might sound silly today, but you remember the tone. Mythic, mournful. It started with tragedy. Thundera destroyed, their people scattered. The survivors drift through space, their home gone, their purpose barely holding. That's not a cheerful setup. That's exile. Even the villain, Mum-Ra, wasn't just a bad guy. He was the embodiment of decay, an immortal corpse sustained by evil energy. His voice, that rasping growl, seemed to come from inside your own nightmares. The animation had this heavy stillness, dust in the ruins, lightning flashing against black stone. Underneath the laser swords and power poses, ThunderCats was about survival, memory, and what happens when your world is gone. Compare that to the remakes that came later, all irony and speed. The original dared to linger in silence. It let you feel what loss cost. Maybe that's why, even now, hearing ThunderCats gives you a rush that isn't just nostalgia, it's grief remembered as power. Do you remember the Smurfs being scary? Most people don't until they think about it. Sure, it was cute and bouncy on the surface, but Gargamel wasn't a cartoon goof. He was a wizard obsessed with capturing and consuming the Smurfs. He wanted to turn them into gold, or food. The forest was endless, shadowy, full of danger. The Smurfs lived in constant fear of being caught, of losing one another. There's something primal about that. Maybe that's why it stuck. Even the happiness of Smurf Village always felt fragile, like one wrong step could shatter it. The darker subtext whispered something every kid eventually learns. No matter how cozy life feels, the world beyond the trees is hungry. It's strange, isn't it, how so many of these safe shows made you feel uneasy, and yet that unease helped shape who you became. It taught you empathy, caution, maybe even curiosity. It told you that darkness wasn't always the enemy. Sometimes it was just part of growing up. Now think about Inspector Gadget. At first, it was pure comedy, bumbling detective, high-tech gadgets, endless pratfalls, but the real story was hidden in plain sight. Dr. Claus. Face was never shown. His voice, cold and disembodied, haunted every episode. The world Gadget lived in was gray, industrial, strangely joyless. The truth is, the humor only worked because the setting felt so bleak. Penny, the real hero, was a child trying to keep her oblivious guardian alive. That's not slapstick. That's survival comedy. The idea that the adults were incompetent, that the kids were the only ones holding things together, it was a mirror of what many kids quietly felt at home. You probably laughed, but something about that imbalance stuck in your chest, didn't it? And here's a subtle one, M.A.S.K. You might remember the vehicles, cars that turned into planes, explosions, action figures lined up on your bedroom floor. But underneath the toy commercial energy was something darker. Every episode revolved around sabotage, betrayal, and the thin line between law and chaos. The villains weren't monsters, they were humans, driven by greed and vengeance. It was a world where technology was both savior and destroyer, where good and evil looked almost identical behind those visors. The music was synth-heavy but cold, the color palette washed out metal. Even as a kid, you could feel it, that anxious hum of the future closing in. Today's kids see drones and AI as background noise. Back then, M.A.S.K. was a warning. What happens when the machines are smarter than their masters? And then there was He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Everyone remembers the catchphrase, the sword, the muscles, but do you remember the fear that lived underneath? The show was built on duality, light versus shadow, identity versus secrecy. Prince Adam's transformation wasn't just magic, it was repression. A boy who had to hide his true power, his true self, from everyone he loved. Skeletor wasn't just a skeleton-faced villain, he was death given personality. The animation exaggerated his grin, but behind it was something deeply unsettling, an enemy that couldn't die, couldn't rest, and could never stop mocking you. That constant tension between strength and fear, courage and pretense wasn't lost on you as a kid. You might not have had the words, but you felt it. You knew that being powerful didn't mean you weren't scared. And maybe that's what the 80s were really teaching you through all these stories. That darkness wasn't something to be avoided. It was something to understand. When you look back now, do you realize how much those shows shaped the way you see the world? How they taught you to find light not by running from the shadows, but by walking through them? Do you remember the first time you saw the mysterious cities of gold? It didn't look like anything else on TV. The animation had that golden haze, that slow, dreamlike rhythm. The soundtrack, those eerie synthesizers and flutes, felt ancient and futuristic all at once. You probably didn't realize it then, but this was a show about colonialism, loss, and the price of curiosity. It told the story of children chasing legend through the ruins of fallen empires. Every episode was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that made you feel small, like the world was older than you could imagine. The adults weren't always kind, the ruins weren't always empty, and the treasure, it wasn't what anyone expected. Even as a kid, you could sense the melancholy behind the adventure, the way the camera lingered on broken statues, crumbling cities swallowed by jungle. You could feel the ghosts of history in every frame. Compare that to today's fast-paced, hyper-bright cartoons. Back then, the mysterious cities of gold didn't rush. It wanted you to feel time, its weight, its sadness. Do you remember that strange ache, like you were learning something too big for your age? Then came Pinwheel. You might remember it as soft, weird, and endless. It wasn't a typical show. It was a dream stitched together from puppets, claymation, and foreign shorts. But there was something off about it, wasn't there? The lighting was dim, the puppets moved a little too slowly, and the music sometimes felt more funereal than playful. It was supposed to feel safe, like a preschool paradise, but in hindsight, it had this uncanny stillness, like a place that existed outside of time. You could almost smell the felt and dust, hear the slow creak of set pieces between segments. For many kids, Pinwheel was their first encounter with liminality, that eerie space between comfort and discomfort, where things seem normal, but your instincts say otherwise. Shows today avoid that kind of stillness. Everything is kinetic, loud, overstimulating, but Pinwheel gave you permission to just sit in the quiet, to be a little uncertain. Maybe that's why, decades later, you still remember that strange emptiness it left behind. Voltron, Defender of the Universe. took the 80s obsession with heroism and turned it into something almost mythic. The music thundered, the visuals gleamed, and the lions roared, but underneath the spectacle was a story about trauma, loss, and responsibility too heavy for young shoulders. Remember how the pilots barely smiled? How the world they fought for was always on the brink of ruin? When Sven was injured and written out of the series, the tone shifted from heroic to haunted. Death wasn't abstract. It had faces, names, uniforms. And the villains, Zarkon, Hagar, they weren't comedic. They were cruel. The monsters they sent weren't just physical threats. They were reflections of despair, of war's endless churn. As a kid, you probably didn't have words for that, but you could feel the fatigue in the story's bones. It was epic, yes, but it was also exhausted. When you compare that to today's team shows, where friendship always saves the day, it's almost jarring. Voltron told you that sometimes friendship isn't enough. Sometimes people get hurt anyway, and yet the act of trying mattered. Isn't that what you carried with you long after the toys were gone? That stubborn insistence on hope, even in ruin? Let's talk about Captain Planet and the Planeteers. You might think of it as campy now, all bright colors and eco lessons, but those early episodes, they were darker than people remember. Toxic waste, famine, extinction. It wasn't fantasy, it was apocalypse repackaged for Saturday morning. The villains weren't superhuman, they were reflections of human greed. Do you remember the episode Deadly Ransom, where warlords kidnap the Planeteers, or the one where a town's children are poisoned by lead pollution? These weren't metaphors, they were warnings. Captain Planet was trying to tell you something that adults weren't saying out loud, that the world was breaking, and you were inheriting it. Even the animation had a grim tone. Grays, rust reds, the sickly glow of industrial smoke. You could almost smell the smog through the screen. It wasn't pretending that everything would be fine, it was pleading with you to care. Today, shows sanitize climate issues into hashtags and slogans. Back then, Captain Planet trusted you to face guilt and responsibility head on. And then there was Gem and the Holograms. It looked glamorous, neon lights, pop music, sparkle, and rebellion. But behind the sequins, it was surprisingly tragic. Jerrica Benton lived a double life, hiding her identity even from the people she loved. Every episode carried that undertone of loneliness, of never being able to truly be seen. The Misfits weren't just villains, they were cautionary tales about fame and ego. The whole show pulsed with the 80s dream, success, beauty, control, but it also whispered the nightmare underneath. Burnout, secrecy, and self-erasure. You can still hear those synth beats in your mind, can't you? They weren't cheerful, they were haunted. The show was trying to tell you something about growing up in a world where image mattered more than truth, about what it costs to keep pretending. Muppet Babies might surprise you on this list, but think back. Every episode took place in one room, the nursery. The walls never changed, and the only adult presence was Nanny, from the knees down. That's unsettling when you really think about it. The characters were isolated, using imagination to escape a world they couldn't leave. The adventures were colorful, sure, but they always ended the same way. With the toys back on the floor, the world still small and controlled. As a kid, maybe it felt cozy, but looking back, it feels claustrophobic. You can almost hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above them, the silence when the daydreams fade. Muppet Babies taught you that imagination was both salvation and a cage. You could dream your way anywhere, but you still had to wake up. Do you remember that pang, that wish that the daydreams could last just a little longer? And then there was Babar, a gentle elephant king in a civilized world of talking animals. Harmless, right? Except the show begins with his mother's death, gunned down by a hunter right in front of him. No warning, no sugarcoating, just grief, sudden and irrevocable. That single moment colored the entire series. Every bit of wisdom, every act of kindness Babar offered came from that loss. The show was about grief processed into gentleness, about the cycle of pain that teaches compassion. That's a lesson most adult dramas can't manage to deliver, but you, sitting cross-legged on the floor, felt it. You didn't understand why your throat tightened when he talked about the old days. You were just a kid, but the emotion was real. Shows like that didn't talk down to you. They let you feel the cost of love. Today's cartoons often skip the hurt and jump straight to the healing. But the 80s let the wound bleed first. Do you remember the Littles? Tiny people living secretly inside human homes. It sounds whimsical, but there was a loneliness to it, wasn't there? A constant fear of discovery. The Littles lived in the walls, scavenging crumbs, hiding from cats, always unseen. It was a story about existing in the margins, about building safety in spaces never meant for you. Every adventure carried that quiet anxiety. One wrong move, and everything could collapse. You didn't realize it at the time, but it was teaching you empathy for the unseen, the small, the powerless. Compare that to modern, cute series that chase laughs. The Littles whispered about survival, invisibility, and the dignity of being overlooked. You might not have known it, but you were learning about what it means to belong when you don't fit anywhere. The 80s didn't protect you from hard truths. It trusted trusted you with them. And when you think about it now, those dark undertones weren't mistakes. They were invitations to wonder, to feel, to grow. So tell me, when you think back to those dimly lit mornings and flickering VHS tapes, which story still visits you in your dreams? The one that felt less like entertainment and more like a secret message you weren't supposed to hear? You remember DuckTales, don't you? The theme song alone could lift your heart. Life is like a hurricane, but for all its brightness, that show hid a strange melancholy under the laughter. Scrooge McDuck wasn't just rich, he was lonely. Every treasure he chased was another attempt to fill an emptiness he could never quite name. When you were a kid, you saw adventure, glittering caves, ancient curses, maps that led to the unknown. But underneath the gold and comedy, it was a story about obsession, about how even the richest heart can ache for something real. You probably didn't realize it then, but you were watching a man chase ghosts. His fortune couldn't buy him time, or family, or peace. And maybe that's why the quieter episodes, the ones where Scrooge looked out over his vault in silence, hit harder than the wild ones. Because somewhere, even as a kid, you understood treasure only matters if you have someone to share it with. Then there was The Adventures of the Gummi Bears. On paper, it was whimsical, magical bears bouncing around medieval forests. But think about what it was really about: extinction. The Gummies were the last of their kind, living in hiding, afraid of discovery, preserving the memory of a once great civilization. Their world was shrinking and they knew it. Every artifact they found, every secret tunnel was a link to a vanished past. And you, watching wide-eyed, were absorbing the sadness of heritage. Lost. The show was funny and warm, yes, but that warmth came from the awareness that their time had passed. Even as a child, you could feel it. The empty halls, the dust of forgotten magic, the sense that history doesn't come back, it just echoes. Compare that to today's shows, where every legacy is rebooted, revived, recycled. Back then, Gummi Bears dared to say goodbye. Do you think that's why it still lives in your memory? Not as a laugh, but as a whisper. Now let's talk about the Care Bears. Everyone remembers the colors, the rainbows, the belly badges. But behind the sweetness, the stories were startlingly emotional. Each episode revolved around loneliness, fear, rejection, heavy stuff wrapped in pastel light. You might remember the villains: Cold Heart, Dark Heart, figures who weren't pure evil, just empty. They weren't monsters to defeat, they were souls to heal. That's a profound idea for a show aimed at 5-year-olds. It said that darkness isn't destroyed, it's comforted, understood, forgiven. And that's the thing, isn't it? The 80s trusted you with emotional complexity. It didn't treat kindness as naive, it treated it as the hardest thing in the world. The Care Bears didn't just teach you to care, they showed you what it costs to keep caring in a world that kept breaking hearts. Rainbow Brite carried that same strange contradiction. Light and darkness weren't metaphors, they were forces. The color kids fought against the creeping gray that threatened to erase the world. You can probably still see it, the color fading from the sky, the air going cold. It was cheerful on the surface, but the stakes were existential. Without light, everything dies. It was a story about depression before we had words for it. The idea that the world's beauty depended on someone's effort to make it bright again. And that sometimes, even Rainbow Brite felt tired. That's the part you might have missed as a kid, the quiet vulnerability beneath her smile. You could feel it though. You knew that holding on to light was work. And maybe that stuck with you in ways you didn't realize until years later. Or at least that's what Tales from the Darkside felt like when you caught it accidentally, too late at night. It wasn't meant for children, not really, but you saw it anyway. Those eerie intros, that whispered phrase, "The dark side is always there." It was horror stripped of gore, psychological, moral, chilling, and it taught you something few grown-up shows ever do: that the scariest monsters are people, and the cruelest moments are the ones that make sense. You watch stories about greed, punishment, regret, and though you didn't fully grasp the meaning, you felt the unease that truth brings. That's what the 80s did best. It blurred the line between children's curiosity and adult awareness. It showed you that knowledge has a cost. Even something as playful as Pee-wee's Playhouse carried that undercurrent. On the surface, it was chaos, bright colors, talking furniture, laughter that never stopped. But it was also surreal, unnerving, even claustrophobic. The house was alive, but it never changed. Every day was a loop of joy that felt just a little too forced. As a kid, you might not have noticed the unease behind the absurdity, but it was there. That quiet suggestion that play, taken too far, can start to feel like madness. Pee-wee's world was fun, but it was trapped. And maybe, just maybe, that's why you couldn't look away. Now let's not forget David the Gnome. A soft-spoken, wise old gnome living peacefully in the forest with his wife, Lisa. The show was tender, gentle, almost hypnotic, but its final episode, it shattered hearts. David and Lisa, after a long life, knew their time had come. They said their goodbyes, walked into the woods, and quietly turned into trees. No tricks, no magic reversal, just death, accepted with grace. That wasn't trauma, it was truth. It was one of the few times a children's show allowed the ending we all eventually face. It told you that love doesn't stop death, but it can make the ending beautiful. You might not have cried then, but you remember it now, don't you? That image of two trees side by side, eternal, gentle, together. It was the last great kindness of 80s storytelling, to remind you that growing up means learning to let go. And finally, Jim Henson's The Storyteller. Every frame of that show felt ancient, like a bedtime story whispered by candlelight. John Hurt, wrapped in shadows and firelight, spinning tales of gods, fools, and monsters. The creatures were grotesque, the lessons sharp. Every story had a moral, but not a happy one. The endings were often bittersweet, sometimes cruel, always honest. It was the perfect end to an era that believed children deserved the truth. That wonder and sorrow belonged together. That fear wasn't something to shield you from. It was something to understand. And when you look back. Now, when you think about all the dark threads running through those bright, hand-painted worlds, you start to realize something. Those shows didn't ruin your childhood, they prepared you for life. Because life is Fraggle Rock and Watership Down, Care Bears and Darkside. It's laughter and loss, innocence and awareness, color and shadow. Those stories taught you that darkness doesn't destroy the light, it defines it. So the next time someone says the 80s were simpler, safer, softer, think about the shows that raised you. Think about the moments that made you gasp, ache, or wonder. You weren't being protected, you were being initiated. Now tell me, what's the one image you still see when you close your eyes? The one scene that never left you even after all these years? Drop it in the comments below, because maybe your memory is the one that brings someone else back to theirs. And if this walk through the shadows stirred something in you, hit that like button, share it with someone who grew up in that same flickering glow, and subscribe for more journeys back into the stories that made us.